Is this a flashpoint, Scott, or is this going to be an extended period of political, social disruption in China in response to what is essentially policy, right, from the Chinese government?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think that's an excellent question. Certainly, these protests are unprecedented. They're unlike anything we've seen. The quickness with which they spiraled and the fact that they are taking place across multiple cities, across multiple geographies, and that somehow people in one city seem to be aware of people in other cities who were protesting and were, drawing inspiration from each other. That is something that we rarely see in China, where the state is normally so good at atomizing these things and sort of sweeping them under the rug. This is going to be much harder to put it back in the bottle, so to speak.
Scott, already, of course, many an international company has been worried about doing business in China, largely because of the COVID lockdowns, and also add that a healthy dose of geopolitical tensions between, for example, the US and China, antagonized in some way, perhaps over the course of the weekend, the news that ZTE and the likes of Huawei won't be able to sell their products into the US. How does this affect, for example, US-China relations going forward?
Well, I don't know how much bearing this has specifically on US-China relations, but US officials have to tread really carefully here because they want to show their support and they want to express their support for any sort of, free and open protest, especially one that might, signal a greater desire even for democracy. Some people have been talking about, which is, very rare. But the second US officials step in and start, saying how much they support it, China can latch onto those sorts of narratives and start to spin it as this is something that, was cooked up by the US, start going to this sort of conspiracy theory propaganda. And so that's something they have to tread very lightly, not just because they don't want to, make the protesters look bad, but also because that could also, really harm US-China relations, which are just starting to recover after the recent Xi-Biden meeting.
Scott, earlier today, I spoke to the CFO of Infineon, a chip maker that has a significant operational and sales footprint in China. This is what he had to say about the situation.
We have really improved our resilience a lot over the past quarters, months, and years, and therefore we are looking at with concern. But up to now, there is no direct implication visible on our operations in China or the region, and we have backup plans in case it becomes necessary to make adjustments.
When I listen to Sven, he makes it seem like this is just the latest in a string of ongoing disruption. What is your assessment about the reality of life on the ground and operating in China right now?
Well, I don't get the sense that everything has ground to a halt, but I do get the sense that we're in sort of a wait and see moment. It doesn't seem like they've been able to disperse these crowds. They sort of missed the window on, censoring and isolating it right away. And even as they start to do that, people know that these protests are going on and they, are aware. People are showing up with their blank pieces of paper. That's been the real prop of the protest. Whether it's sort of grinding to a halt, you talked about earlier those protests in Zhengzhou, but those were more isolated. I get the sense that these are more, urban middle class protests. We haven't seen so much labor protest outside of that. So it's a question, but there's a lot of uncertainty. And we know that sometimes COVID lockdowns have been used almost politically. And so, anything is sort of on the table. Really waiting to see how this will unfold.
Now, I know in some ways what has occurred at the Foxconn iPhone City, as it's known, is somewhat different to what's happening now on the streets of Beijing, of Shanghai, but they are related. And a lot of this is frustration about the way in which people survive amid these COVID lockdowns, Scott. Many have been looking at Apple in this situation, of course, key supplier being that of Foxconn, their exposure being significant, that they just didn't build enough alternatives. They didn't focus enough. They were too heavily dependent as a supply chain on China and didn't do much to really disperse that. Do you think companies are now significantly moving away from a Chinese supply chain, or will they look to just think that this is an episode?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it predates this. I think it was over the summer, after House Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan and there was that deeply jingoist military reaction, people got really spooked and they started for the first time to envision a future where China might become, for a lot of multinational companies, geopolitically off limits. And they all started to scramble and started to think, wow, we need to look at serious contingency planning. And things only seem to get worse from there. That's what we saw in our data. Relations seem to get worse and worse. Bilateral negativity only got worse. And then this really did seem to be affecting both China and the US. People were concerned. Xi and Biden met. It seemed to calm temperatures, not change anything, but really put a floor under relations. And then this happens, So.
Right. Scott, we asked our audience what's top of mind for them and concern about what's happening on the ground, specifically with Apple. Their answer very clear: working conditions. My question to you, those working conditions, what we've seen on the streets, do we see a policy pivot from the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think one thing is that the government is sometimes more responsive than people realize in China because they don't have the release valve of elections like we have. So they're going to have to move in order to quell dissent, but they have to be very careful because, if they open up too quickly, then it could really embolden and enable these protesters. So I think they're going to tread lightly, but I don't see anything really terrible happening just yet, but we're waiting. It could be a victory for the protesters. We don't know. There might be small movements.